Um, but I guess having mentioned dynamic strategy, it's time to ask David Worsley, DW, to tell us about his strategic scenario. And I guess agility works on a slightly different timescale in this example, but I guess you could still we still need agility in some measure. It just might not be to change our minds one week to the next. So David, are you ready to roll? Are you,
Yes, just do share screen. Should that let me share my? Oh, it says here host disabled participant screen sharing.
well, it is. I think you popped out and came back in again, and I've stupidly then not made you a co-host again, and I've now uh, done that.
Great. Right, so it should work now then. Great. Okay. So it's now telling me it's sharing my screen. Is that correct?
It is.
Great. Okay, I'll start then. So David said I was going to share an example from the British railway industry, but really the example is the whole industry itself. And I think it does actually, if you look at the history of the British railway industry over the last 25 years or so, it does actually illustrate some of the things that the big are interested in terms of accountability and information flow. So if you cast your mind back, we started off after privatisation with Railtrack PLC. Now, this is the only big bit of text in my presentation to read through, but it is worth glancing through that because it describes how some business historians characterised what Railtrack PLC was doing. Effectively, it was the company that owned and operated the infrastructure. It got income from the government, but also from the train companies who paid what were called track access charges to use the railway network. But then the problem with Railtrack was that it outsourced an awful lot of what its key responsibilities were. So it had maintenance undertaken by various contractors. And then when it did projects to renew or enhance the railway network, it used a lot of consultants. And in terms of strategy, it actually thought that people would basically buy improvements off it. So if the government wanted an improvement, it would just pay Railtrack more money in order to implement that. And if, for example, a major private freight company wanted some improvement to the railway network for its own business activities, they might just fund it themselves and pay Railtrack to do it. And then Railtrack would just outsource things to contractors and so on. So it's accused of basically being a rent-seeking type company that was just trying to make money off the fact it owned the asset. And as you can see, if you read through this bit of text, it says that Railtrack became an uninformed buyer of others' knowledge and technology, which as an engineering firm was a pretty bad place to be. Now, when Labour came to power in '97, they did try to add a bit of strategic thinking by creating a body called the Strategic Rail Authority, the history of which is covered in the book I've shown you on the right there. But still, Railtrack itself wasn't doing a great deal of strategizing. Now you can actually, outsource some things in your business, but they don't really include responsibility for safety. In 1997, we had the Southall rail crash just outside London, which remains the worst rail disaster of the last 30 years. About 30 people killed there. And so Railtrack is a very reactive type of company concentrated on reducing signals past a danger, which is what had caused the Southall accident when a train went past a red signal. What it wasn't so good at was identifying broken rails. And as you can see in the diagram on the right, they didn't manage to get them down nearly quite so much, which meant that unfortunately, when we had another tragic accident at Hatfield on the East Coast Main Line in October 2000, the whole network ground to a halt. You can see here there's a book that was written called The Crash That Stopped Britain. Given the number of train services that were cancelled and the speed restrictions put on, that's not really that much of an exaggeration. And the problem was Railtrack said they really didn't know how many broken rails there might be and the scale that this risk posed to the railway network. and you can see there Gerald Corbett, who was the chief exec at the time. Private Eye, if you can't quite read it, has got him saying there, the trains are now completely safe, there aren't any. And he did resign shortly after that, and went off to lead Woolworths and then Paddy Power and Betfair. And some people were saying, well, maybe being an expert on those types of businesses, does that really qualify you to be in charge of the railway network and all the engineering? But it wasn't just safety, really, that was Railtrack's problem. It was, as I mentioned, they weren't really doing a great deal in the way of strategic planning. Now, David's already alluded to this, that we have this idea in strategy of the difference between a deliberate strategy or an intended strategy where you just formulate a plan and do it, and what we tend to have today, which is emerging strategies. Where you respond to changes in your environment, and something maybe happens a bit different from what you originally expected. So these are the original diagrams that possibly the patron saint of strategic planning, Henry Mintzberg, came up with, showing the arrows are your intentions, and they were originally pointing towards vision number one in the middle there, and the world changed and you ended up enacting vision number two. And then the bottom diagram, hopefully, yes, you learn from what's happened and then feed that back into your future planning. So those are all themes that are actually in the IASP body of knowledge, and David's already touched on. Now, the thing with Railtrack is they were almost completely doing an emerging strategy by outsourcing the strategic thinking to the government and their customers. And so they probably took the emerging strategy idea too far and devolved accountability. And it wasn't just for safety, it was for costs as well. So one of the big projects that we had at the time, the West Coast route modernisation, the West Coast Main Line, is arguably the most important railway line in Britain. It connects London to Birmingham, Manchester, Glasgow, so the second, third and fourth largest cities, and is a major freight route as well. That needed significant improvement at the beginning of this century, and the government paid for Railtrack to do a project, but rather a programme really. But they lost complete control of the costs. So you can see in the diagram on the left, April 2002, they said they'd already spent 30% of the budget, but only delivered about 17% of the work. And the anticipated final cost of the whole thing spiraled out of control from under 2 billion in May 96 was the anticipated cost. And this is in constant prices as well, 2005-6 prices, up to over 14 billion they were expecting in May 2002. Now, coincidentally, that is when I joined the railway industry, and as you can see, there was an immediate improvement. But seeing as my role was just making the tea and doing the filing in the team which looked after level crossings in Lincolnshire at that point, I can't claim personal responsibility. But this was one of the contributory factors, along with the safety issues, to Railtrack being replaced by Network Rail. And the idea was to try and get the total subsidy to the railway industry down from the public purse. At the beginning of privatisation, sort of 94, 95, it had been quite low, which is what we've been led to believe from the previous government. But with West Coast route modernisation, the net cost to the taxpayer started growing. And in fact, even after Network Rail was created in 2002, they were still dealing with the after effects of the Railtrack years and having to invest a lot to stop the rot. As we said at the time. So it took a while to get the public subsidy back down again, and then it started creeping up with performance problems and things in 1819. Of course, the whole industry's been renationalised effectively since the COVID pandemic now. So Network Rail wasn't completely successful in that, but the railway industry was restructured. We love these diagrams to show the structure of the railway industry. They always have the government at the top and the passengers at the bottom. We're trying to actually look at ways of putting passengers more in the centre or at the top to show that we do exist to serve a public need. But this diagram shows how the rail industry worked in the Network Rail years, with the Department for Transport actually letting out franchises to the train operating companies, and then some of their money coming back to Network Rail through track access charges. So really, it's not misleading, though the Department for Transport very much is in control. So what we were trying to do in Network Rail was try and think more strategically about our projects. Initially, I worked in project management at Network Rail, and they were trying to bring in more value management and project reviews. So we thought more about what our projects were intended to achieve. This was some guidance that was given to project sponsors in 2013 manual there, pointing out that a project that is well defined and poorly executed will probably still add more value to the organisation or the industry than one that is poorly defined but well executed. So I got involved a lot in value management workshops and trying to make sure we came up with good ideas for what projects were at the beginning. So that was one way of trying to get the costs controlled again. And then about 2007, I moved over into strategic planning. And what we were asked to do really was what we call the predict and provide model of strategic planning, where you basically assess what demand is going to be in the future, and then recommend whatever infrastructure or service improvements are necessary to meet that demand. So I say within transport planning, we call that predict and provide. The problem, of course, is that the future is inherently unknown and unknowable even. So what we did was we did scenario planning, which ties in with the IASP body of knowledge as it's the very first tool that is mentioned in the tools section of our body of knowledge, looking at different alternative scenarios for the future. So this shows 4 that we came up with for Network Rail strategic planning. The main axes of uncertainty were whether Britain was what we call a global player integrated in the world economy, which was very much associated with our own economy being London-centric, or whether it would be decentralised with more growth out in the regions, less dependent on London. And the other aspect was sustainability. Do we go in for a lot of recycling and decarbonisation, or do we say we don't care about that? Unabated consumption was the opposite pole there. Interestingly, later on, people were looking at the decentralisation scenario and said, well, how on earth would that come about? I mean, what are you saying? Britain would leave the European Union? That would never happen, people said. And we actually ended up discounting some of those scenarios. So that just shows you how reality can trip you up in the end. But what we would do is we'd go through and we'd actually, under these different scenarios, we'd come up with forecasts for demand. So this shows the sort of 9 major cities in Britain outside, or in England rather, outside London, and our forecasts for how much commute demand into those cities would increase by 2023 and 2043 under the different scenarios that we came up with. So we were all hoping for the top right scenario, prospering in global stability as the future for Britain. But I think we're in one of the bottom ones now. I think struggling in isolation or struggling in global turmoil, one of the two. And of course, nobody anticipated anything like COVID coming along. Problem with this sort of thing is part of the job of the rail industry really is actually to support the economy and support the growth of the economy. And not all journeys and not all connections between different towns do that equally. One of the things my current employer, Transport for the North, looks at is what we call strategic development corridors. And the theory behind this is actually you get a bigger return on investment if you connect areas where people have similar skills and there are similar types of company operating, because you get more of what we call a labour market agglomeration and business-to-business contact. So in these different corridors in the north of England, one of the interesting ones is F, West Coast to Sheffield region, and that's intended to connect lots of high technology manufacturing in Lancashire to high technology manufacturing in South Yorkshire. So we're looking at trying to improve transport connections between those two areas. Similarly, Route A at the top there, connecting Cumbria to sort of Teesside area, we call connecting the energy coasts. So you've got nuclear reprocessing at Sellafield, a nuclear power station at Hartlepool, and you've also got lots of companies working in renewable energy in those areas. So we regard that as having a bigger bang for your buck as well, if you can get better connections between those areas. So we're now trying to move really now in this final slide into a new structure, which looks in many ways similar to the old structure. You've still got the politicians at the top there, but Great British Railways will now have more of a direct relationship with the train companies when it comes about. It'll let contracts to them. We won't have the franchising system anymore. The train companies will just basically do what they're told by this new body, Great British Railways. The really interesting thing is we're trying to get regional partners and local government and locally elected people more involved. So if you look in the top right there, you've got regional partners and devolved authorities. So this is a way we're trying to get people like locally elected mayors, people like Andy Burnham, to have more influence over what happens in the railway industry. So the individual regions of Great British Railways are expected to have their own direct relationship with mayoral combined authorities. And that's a way of getting local knowledge about what we need and how transport investment will support economic growth and other social objectives, to get that information in at a local level and not have to do everything via London, which has basically been the system we've had in the past. So that's the new structure. But as you can tell, this is 2022, and it was already supposed to be in place by 2024. So I think it's going to be 2027 before this is operating, to be honest. But the idea is interesting, even if we're a bit behind schedule on the delivery. So as I said, in looking at the history of the railway industry and how it's structured, there are some interesting questions about accountability and information flow and other sorts of topics that David's already touched on. And I'll stop it there.